Hey everybody, welcome back again. Top of the afternoon, Friday. You're listening to the Entrepreneurial Web. Juicy conversation today with attorney Eric Sarver. He is a New York City-based attorney that specializes in employment law and business law, which is got to be top of mind for business owners these days because it is a constantly changing environment. I know just from the restaurant side of things and the forget about even the employees yet, just everybody's scrambling to set up these street side cafes where they're taking over parking spaces and building their enclosures, and literally every week the city announces like an adjustment, and sometimes you don't get a warning and they just show up. It could be Department of Transportation, Department of Buildings, Department of Health, they basically said be ready for anybody to come through. And they may just give you a fine. That might be like your awareness of the situation is a fine. Like, oh, you can't do that, or it has to be this, or they've got the tape out and the white gloves, and it's a kind of a hot mess. And from your perspective, you're seeing just like a panorama of constantly changing, updating regulations that particularly apply to employees, correct?
Absolutely, Jeremiah. I'm seeing a lot of that. I mean, everything you described in terms of just you've got the city and their ordinances around things like cafes, and the parking space is a good example. You've got the Department of Licensing and Consumer Affairs, and you've also got the Department of Labor. The New York State Department of Labor is a very powerful branch of the government and a very aggressive branch at that. And so you've got your longstanding employment laws and labor and wage and hour laws that have been in effect long before COVID-19 struck and long before the pandemic. But you've also got now different laws around things like sick leave, quarantine leave. You've got extra pay for quarantine employees if that does arise. We've got federal legislation, right? The Families First Coronavirus Response Act, also known as the FFCRA, which has to do with how you as a business owner need to operate and need to change your paid sick leave policies, right? You get certain emergency FMLA, emergency paid sick leave. So there's certainly all those aspects involved. And you've got also, again, longstanding laws like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is very relevant when an employer is screening new applicants for jobs, hiring, firing, making accommodations. And now we're seeing more questions come up around COVID-19, around what to do if an employee refuses to come to work, and what to do if an employee requests a certain accommodation. What if you're a small place that can't do it, that's an undue hardship? How do you respond? What does the law say about testing? Can you test employees for COVID-19 diagnosis before coming on to your workspace? And the answer is yes. Can you test them for antibodies for COVID-19? The answer is no. It has to do with what the ADA allows in terms of the invasiveness of your medical information you take. And there are rules around the CDC guidelines around how to create a safe workplace. So there's really a lot out there. Unemployment insurance. If we had more time to talk, and I'd love to talk to you for hours because you're an interesting guy.
Well, that's why you're starting your own show, right? Because you can talk for weeks, days about this.
Yep. To get to go talk for days and days, exactly.
Yeah.
But one of my goals is to convey to people an overview of some of these laws and just some of the hot spots. What are the most common needs of businesses? What are the most common concerns? What have I seen the most about that's happening? So I wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, please.
You, of course, sure. But also wanted to convey that if there's any good takeaway from this show today, that you don't know what you don't know. So I just caution businesses about being careful about reading, say, a limited excerpt or segment about employment law and COVID-19. Let's say on Google, like on the internet, like googling an issue, and thinking that that's the whole the whole shebang, right? That's the issue in a nutshell. When in fact it's much more complicated than that. So that's one of my goals, is just give some information that's helpful, but also let people know, what issues do I, as a business owner, whether I'm the coffee shop on the street or the tech service company where everyone works from home, and I think to myself, this doesn't apply to me. My workers are all at home on Zoom and FaceTime, and they're all online, and So, but actually, you have a lot of concerns to think about. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that. I mean, I'm happy to follow your lead
Yeah,
here.
I mean, it's come up with my businesses. I've got a number of employees at each one, but they're all pretty small. And it feels like, these days you have to be super sensitive to everybody's needs. I mean, first and foremost, we had to really pay attention to our customers and what was going to make them most comfortable, so that they still had confidence to engage in commerce with us. But if an employee says in any way to me these days, I'm not feeling so good, I'm like, you stay home. Like, just we'll cover it. Like, it's not even a problem. And I'm not even, I'm less concerned about being penalized, from any government agency for that. First and foremost is just everybody's safety. But that's for me, like, top of mind. If you could talk for a moment about your most recent discoveries dealing with employees that one are just say, they're just like, I'm not feeling well, I don't want to come in, or ones that are the opposite, appear to not feel so good, not look so good, but they're interested in working. How can employers navigate those two? They seem like the most sticky situations to me.
They are sticky situations, and they're very common, so I'm glad you brought them up. I'm also glad you're reminded to hear you say that, you don't mind tackling this issue, having people stay home, not just because of what the law might require or what the CDC guidelines might say, but because, it's just right, it's good practice. It's the promoting the safety of your employees, and it's good karma. And, if you backtrack a little bit, I don't know at what point, but I remember saying to you that there are a lot of these guidelines and regulations that I'm actually all for them. I think, the CDC guidelines, OSHA has, to help create a safe workplace. The goal is we don't want workers coming back, getting sick, and being a mass cluster where then they go home and spread the disease, COVID-19, to their families, loved ones, or random strangers. So let's take each scenario. This person does not want to come in because they're not feeling well, and so I would see that situation is interesting. I would also look at how long is the employee not wanting to come in for? Is it, hey boss, I don't want to come in today. I'm feeling like headachy, a little achy, a little tired. Or, hey, I don't want to come in because I'm not feeling well, and it goes on for weeks and weeks. So there's no doctors, no medical follow-up. So if an employee doesn't want to come in, and if they're not feeling well, especially these days, the good practice is to advise them to stay home. And if an employee is claiming that they're, an ongoing issue of, let's say, like, fever or chills or COVID-19 type symptoms, you can ask them for a doctor's note. You're allowed under the ADA, under EEOC guidelines and recommendations to say, hey, you've been out sick. We've got the pandemic, right? The symptoms run the gamut, so you can request that they get tested. You can also take someone's temperature when they come back to work, and ask for symptoms. So that's, I think, I would say that if employees do not want to come in, they're not feeling well, it's always beneficial to have them stay home. But when they do come back, you want to be careful, because if you are not, say, taking certain precautions, another employee to get sick, is that negligence cause of action? Is that an unsafe work environment created? Now, there's another part of that too, that, if I may, a little spin-off, and offset that I've seen, which is employees that say, I'm not sick per se, I'm healthy, I'm fine, and no one in my family is sick, but I read the news every day, man, it freaks me out, I don't want to come back while this COVID-19 is going on, like, I'm afraid to like take a subway, I'm afraid to take a bus, I don't want to walk to work, it's too hot, but they just don't want to come in. And they don't have a pre-existing condition, and they're not in a high-risk group, they're not, let's say, pregnant or over 60. So the question is then, how do you deal with that situation? And they have to be very careful. You look at what are the reasons they're giving. That I say employers need to investigate, communicate and document, and then negotiate with that employee. So investigate, what's happening. Okay, when you say you're afraid to come in, some I've had clients of mine say, well, that's not a legal reason to stay home. I read the Department of Labor guidelines. It says as long as they're healthy and not COVID-19 infected, and they're not sick, and they're not taking care of a child under 18, they have to come back. And if they don't, I'm going to fire them. And I always advise them, like, not so fast, because again, you're looking at one law, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance and Unemployment Insurance, but you're not looking at, say, what's the reason they're giving for not coming in. So if it's I'm afraid, is that fear part of an anxiety disorder they have? Are they someone that suffers from a generalized anxiety disorder or severe anxiety? And in that case, they might have disability under the ADA and under certain New York City state laws. So maybe then you have to like ask, okay, well, do you need an accommodation? Do you need, for example, like say to come in and have your own private office? Do you need to work within, say, a staggered shift, like from 10, 11, 8 p.m. to maybe 7, so that you're missing rush hour, right? So you want to make sure you know the reason people want to stay home. And also, you want to make sure that so you want to inquire, well, what's going on here? How come you want to stay home? Sometimes I've had my clients say, I asked that question in an email, and the person wrote back and they said, hey, oh, I don't want to come in because I make more money at home on unemployment. And that's not, of course, legal. That's an easy, okay, well, that's job abandonment. You can't do that. But the ones that say it's an unsafe work environment, or I don't feel safe at work, if they're making that complaint and you fire them, you could be construed as retaliating against them for a potential OSHA violation they might be stating. So I can talk more about that maybe in the next segment. But my point is you want to ask more questions and document responses and talk to an attorney like myself who can guide you through.
One pressing question I have from what you said from the suggestion is documentation. What, like real quickly in like 60 seconds, what's the best way to document these conversations? Is it an email thread? Is it how would you suggest an employer going about documenting this so that it's got to be kind of time stamped in a way, correct?
Correct. Yes, good question. I definitely recommend email is a very first off, people tend to speak more off the cuff in email and then not self-censor. Whereas if you're sending things through the mail, it could be they have to respond and they talk to. Email is always good. Also, it keeps the continuity and the flow, as you mentioned. You've got a thread, timestamp. I don't recommend text, because people sometimes they miss a text, and they respond to text before that, and they erase the text.
Right.
I think email is great. If you need to send a certified letter, if an employee is really making serious allegations, that's something I can get into after the break. But email is a really good way to communicate, as well as phone, and sometimes having a second person on the phone with you could be very helpful.
Cool. Great. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Sure.
All right. We're going to take another quick break. Hang tight, everybody. We're going to come back and dig into this hole a little deeper. You're listening to the Entrepreneurial Web.